Hey everyone! In this video, we're going to learn how to modify and adjust sunrise and sunset images to make colors pop, add in a little bit of flair, and stylize creatively. So let's jump into On1 Photo Raw 2020 and let's get started. So here inside Photo Raw, I have this sunset photograph. Now, in this tutorial, we're going to be mainly working with underexposed sunrise and sunset images. And the reason being is that I would recommend shooting underexposed whenever you're photographing a sunrise or a sunset. And that's because when you photograph underexposed, yes, you're going to have darker foregrounds like we do here, but you're going to maintain all of that detail and exposure within your sky. So if we were to expose for our foreground here, we would probably have a lot more blown out whites over here within this sky background. So shooting underexposed can be very helpful in situations like this when we're just looking to maintain the integrity of our background and just leave our foreground a little bit dark. We can always go into Photo Raw later and pull up on our shadow tones or remove some contrast. So shooting underexposed is just a helpful thing to do when you're shooting scenes like this. Now, it all depends on the scene. Obviously, if there's something you want in your foreground nice and exposed and you want to make sure that it's captured correctly, you can always capture for your foreground. So for this first edit, we're just going to go in and we're going to pull away a lot of the darker areas in our foreground by using our contrast slider. So to start off, I'm just going to crop the image first. I'm just going to hit C on my keyboard. And then I'm going to pull in on my corner because I have my original ratio up here selected so that it's allowing me to have the 2:3. So then I'll just pull in on the corners here, maybe about there. Then I'm just going to drag this over, and then I'm going to pull up on this crop right here, and I'm basically putting this bottom line on the crop grid, just kind of on top of that horizon line that she's standing on. Just like that. I think that looks pretty good. Just a nice tight composition there. So I'll just hit enter on my keyboard, and there we go. Just a little bit tighter of a frame. So now we need to head in here and open up these shadow tones within our foreground. But we want to protect the detail and the integrity of our sky background here. So the first thing most people would do is they would head over to the shadow tone slider and they would pull that up just like that. And then they would modify, their contrast and add in different tonality adjustments. But for this edit, I'm actually going to start with my contrast slider. So I'm going to pull back on my contrast slider all the way to 100, and that's going to remove all of the contrast from the photograph and really open up these shadowy dark tones in my foreground. Now I'm going to pull up on my midtones a little bit, and that's going to pull out some of these middle grays in my shot. Now I can always add in contrast later. For now, I'm basically just trying to pull out on the exposure and bring in some detail to the sand dunes in our subject. So now I'll head over, I'll pull up on my shadows just a little bit, just like that. And then I'm going to pull back on my black slider. Now pulling back on the black slider is going to incorporate contrast because it's going to add in true black to my image. To do this, I'm going to hold down my J key, and then I'll click it and I'll drag it all the way back, probably about right there. Maybe a little bit less. And what I'm seeing here is in blue, it's showing me true black without any detail. So that's just saying that this is really harsh contrast over here, but the other areas on my foreground look pretty nice, and I think the detail adds in some nice pop. That looks pretty good as far as the tone and color and the foundational look goes. I'm just going to hit the backslash key on my keyboard. So I think we're on the right track. What I want to do now is I want to incorporate some contrast into our sky area, but I'm going to use a local adjustment to do it. So I'm just going to head up to my local adjustments here. And in this local adjustment mask, I'm going to click on this to show the masking options. I'm going to head down to color range. I'm going to click on this color dropper here. I'm going to drop it on this area of sky. And that's going to apply this adjustment strictly to that really bright area in my sky. So I'm going to view this mask, and obviously I don't want it applied to just this area. I want it applied over here on the clouds as well. So what we're going to do is just pull up on our color range a little bit until we're just kind of peeking over the edge of the other one, right about there, until we just can't see it. Right there looks about perfect. So now with my adjustable brush selected, I'm going to head up and make sure I have my perfect brush selected, or I can use Command R to do that. In my perfect brush, I'm going to use my gear to open up these settings, and I'm going to change my color threshold to 11 and my transition to 10. Then I'm just going to paint over these areas of gray clouds until all of my sky is just perfectly white and everywhere else is all black. Just like that. So then I'll head back over to my adjustment. I'm going to view it. And now if I turn this off and on, it does a really good job of darkening that sky area and bringing back some of that detail. So what I can do in this local adjustment is just fine tune how the sky looks now. So I'm going to pull up on my contrast because it looks pretty flat. And that's going to make it nice and detailed, and it's going to bring back some of that darker exposure that we had at the beginning. But it looks a little flat in comparison to our foreground. So I'm going to pull up on the whites just a little bit. Then I'll pull up on my midtones just a hair. Maybe my blacks can go back just a little bit. Like that. Pull up on the midtones maybe a bit more. So now if I head up here and I turn this adjustment off and on, it does a really good job of bringing back in some of that detail that we lost when we pulled back the contrast. And we can always go in and fine tune this adjustment even more. You know, if you want a really moody sky, you could pull up on the contrast even more. I think that looks pretty good just for an example. What we're going to do with this adjustment now is I'm going to head down here to my color area, and I'm going to warm this sky area up a bit. So I'm just going to grab my temperature slider, and I'm just going to pull that over like that. And that's just going to bring in a little bit more warmth and color to the sky. Then I'm going to go down to my saturation, and I'm going to do the same thing. Just pulling up on my saturation. And one thing I could do with this saturation slider is I could pull back a hair, maybe about to, I don't know, 15 or so. That looks pretty good like that. And then we can go to our overall develop tab here. We'll head down to our color area, and let's just warm the entire image up a bit. To do this, I'm going to grab the temperature slider and pull it all the way to the left, and that's going to be really extreme blues. But then we can just gradually and incrementally just pull it to the right until we get, you know, the color that we want, and that seems really intense. But that looks pretty good like that. And then I can pull up on my saturation a little bit. To do that, I'll do the same thing, just pull it all the way to the left. And then just incrementally, like that. I think that looks pretty good right there. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboards, we started with this image, and now we have this photograph. So just an easy way to open up darker tones in your sunrise or sunset photograph, and to bring in specific colors that you want into your sky area. So in the next edit, we'll do a similar modification to our tonality, but then we're going to go in and add a Sunstar with a layer. So let's jump into the next edit. And for our next edit, we have this photograph. So in this photo, we're going to crop it first, just like we did the last edit. But instead of using our contrast slider to alleviate some of these tones in our foreground, we're actually going to use the shadow slider workflow. So I'm going to hit C on my keyboard. I'm going to go up to my ratios here, and I'm going to choose 4:5. Then I'm going to swap the ratio so it's a landscape photograph. Then I'm just going to pull this up a hair like that. So I'm placing this bottom line where these buildings are. And then I'm just going to hit enter on my keyboard. Just like that. So for this edit, we're not going to use the contrast slider method like we did with the last photograph. We're going to head into our shadow slider first. So I'm going to pull up on my shadows, and that's going to pull out those dark shadowy tones in my foreground. Just like that. Then I'm going to pull up on my midtones a little bit. Just like that. And that's going to pull out on some of those middle grays within my photograph. But now my image is looking a little bit too exposed. So we need to add in some contrast. I'm just going to pull up on my contrast slider here. And it's just kind of a fine dance you have to do with your midtones, your shadows, and your contrast, and even your exposure sometimes to get your image looking nice and even. I'm going to pull up on my exposure, pull it back, rather just a little bit, just to bring some detail back into the sky, right there. And then I'll do the same thing I was doing before, just pull up on my midtones a little bit, pull up on my shadows, and I could probably head up to my contrast slider and pull up on the contrast just a little bit. So I'm going to hold down J on my keyboard so I can see that true black with the blue overlay, and I'm just going to pull up till I see a little bit of that on my shot, just like that. That looks pretty good right there. So then I'm going to head down to my white slider. Now, anytime you're pulling up on underexposed photographs, you typically want to avoid the white slider or the highlight slider, but you want to add in a little bit of true white or a little bit of highlights into your image, or the image is going to look really flat. So I'm just going to pull up on my whites just a little bit, just to make the whites pop a little and they're not so flat and dull in the sky area. So I think we're on the right track here. I think that looks pretty good as far as our foundational look goes. What I want to do now is I'm going to head over to my color area, and I'm going to do the same thing we did before. I'm just going to pull back on the temperature all the way to the left. I'm going to use my Kelvin monitor here rather than just the -100 and +100, and then I'll just pull this temperature to the right until I get a vibe I'm going for. That looks pretty good just like that. So now let's go into our effects tab here. I'm going to add a filter, and I'm going to add the color enhancer filter. With the color enhancer filter, I just want to bring out some of the colors and tones in my color range area at the bottom. The first color here I want to pull out is my oranges. So I'm going to go into my orange colors, and I'm just going to pull up on the saturation a bit. And you can see it's just boosting those oranges within the sky. I'll do the same thing with my yellows. And that's going to boost, these bright yellows within our foreground, and also the yellows in the sky area as well. Then I'll do the same thing to my greens. Boost that a little bit. And for my greens, I'm actually going to pull up on the brightness a hair. And that's just going to expose this foreground area a little bit more. So now if I turn this color enhancer filter off and on, it's doing a great job of just boosting those colors. Let's head into our blues real quick, and let's pull up on those all the way as well. And let's pull back on the brightness of those. Actually, let's move that saturation back a hair to about 8. So now we've modified our blues, our yellows, our oranges, really got these colors to pop in our shot here. And so what we can do now to add in a little bit more creative style is let's just add in a Sunstar. So to add in a Sunstar, I'm going to head to my layers, and I'm going to click on this plus button there. And to access your Sunstars, just go to your extras tab here, go into on one extras, go to sun flares, then go to Sunstar, and I'm going to choose this one here, the Sunstar 1. Now, once I add this as a layer, it's just going to reveal itself entirely onto my shot. What I can do to remove this dark background from it is I'm going to use a blend mode. So I'm going to go to my layers. I'm going to make sure I have the Sunstar 1 selected. I'm going to select this gear icon here, and I'm going to go down to screen. Now when I choose screen, that's going to remove the dark background from it. I'm going to hit V on my keyboard so that I can grab this layer and move it around, and I'm just going to select it and drag it down until it's lined up with this area where the sun would be. Now because I'm using that screen blend mode, it's brightening the Sunstar up and I can't really see too much of it. So we can fix that in our Develop tab. I'm just going to go into my Tone and Color pane. I'm going to pull up on my contrast here. Then I'll pull up on my whites a little bit. And then maybe my midtones just a hair like that. So if I turn this off, that's without it. And if I hit Command Z to go back, that's with those modifications to that Sunstar layer. So with the Sunstar layer here, the next thing I want to do is just scale it down a little bit. So I'm going to make sure it's selected. I'm going to make sure I have my transform tool selected, and then I'm going to head up to my scale, and then I'll just pull this back, I don't know, to about 80 or so. That looks pretty good like that. Maybe a little more. 70. 70 looks pretty good. Now let's go back to 80. Perfect. Then I'll just move it around, accordingly, like that. And I think that looks pretty good as far as just a Sunstar goes for our image. So before we merge these two layers together, I'm just going to go into this base layer here, and I'm going to modify our sky so that we have it a little bit more detailed. So I'm going to head over to my local adjustments tab. And with this local adjustment layer, I'm going to hold down Shift and hit K on my keyboard to grab my adjustable gradient. Then I'm going to use my linear bottom preset. I'm going to head over to my horizon line. And now you can see that it's really dimming down that sky area and bringing back a lot of those details that we missed when we pulled up on the midtones and shadows. So in this local adjustment, I want to make sure that it's really feathered so that everything looks natural. But if I turn this off and on, it's really darkening up that building, and I don't like that. So I'm going to head into my gear icon here. And we actually did this in the last video, but it's a really awesome technique for protecting your tones. So I'm going to pull up on these shadow tones with this slider, and that's just going to protect all of the dark shadowy tones from this local adjustment. Then I'll do the same thing with my skin tone slider here, just a little bit, until I've removed a lot of the effect or adjustment from the top of these buildings. And I think we could actually pull up on this adjustment a little bit more, just like that. So now if I turn off this local adjustment, it does an awesome job of relieving the sky area from some of the blown out highlights that were there before. So now I can go in here to my layers. I'm going to right click any of these layers, and I'll choose New Stamped Layer. That's going to duplicate these two layers and merge them together into one composite layer here. So I'll just double click this to rename it Final Composite. And then to stylize this a little bit, I'm just going to head into my Effects tab here. I'll add a filter, and let's just add the Sunshine filter. And the Sunshine filter is awesome for warming up your image, boosting your highlights and midtones, while also keeping the contrast heavy so that it looks like it was taken on a sunshiny, bright day. So if I turn this off and on here, it just makes it look a little more natural for that type of edit. So all I'm going to do in here is I'm going to head to my warmth slider. I'm going to pull that up just a little bit, right about there. Then let's add one last filter. I'm going to add a vignette filter, and we'll finish off with a big softy, and we'll pull back our opacity to about 45. So if I turn this off and on now, just adds in a little bit of darkness around these corners so that we're really fixated on our subject in the center. So now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, we've got a nice little edit on our composite. But let's go into our layers here. I'm going to turn off this final composite layer. I'm going to turn off the Sunstar layer. And now with this photo selected, if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, we started with this photograph. And now let's head up and I'll turn on the composite. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video, please subscribe to our channel to stay updated whenever we drop new content and new videos. Stay safe and have a great rest of your week.